All right, so I'll share my screen and then I'll kind of take you through the research prompt a little bit. And like I said, any questions you have along the way, just let me know. So basically, like this research project, like this is the final thing that we do in English 1, right? That the whole kind of like semester takeaway are like building those moves that are going to be able to help you effectively write the research paper. And so the research project, like it's not going to be due for another month, right? It's not due till the end of the semester, but want to make sure that I give it to all of you like plenty early to kind of start thinking about what you're going to write about. And then also like once we start the writing process, like that can take a little while because a big part of this project is making sure that you're taking the time to be able to do the research, right? Find articles, and I'll talk about like how many articles you'll need and things like that to help kind of basically like inform the argument that you're making. So the basically the point or the kind of the premise of the research project, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be selecting. It's really really open, right? So you're going to be selecting a community of your choice. And it can be any community that you want to focus on, and then think about identifying some sort of meaningful problem that people in this community face, right? And so this can be a community that you're a member of. This can be a community that's maybe important to you because maybe people that you know or care about are members of this community. And then what you're going to do through your research project is once you've identified a problem that people in this community face is kind of do some research to help you both identify the problem and then also find what you think are possible solutions to the problem, right? And then throughout the paper, like kind of the end result is advocating for what you think the best solution is, right? So basically, like you can interpret this idea of like your community in any way you like, right? So you could think of something like, think about the idea like we're all members of multiple communities, right? So I could think about like the community of community college students, or thinking about my role at Solano College and teaching there. It can be thinking about like me as a parent and as part of a community I belong to as of parents, or thinking about like children of immigrants or students who are immigrants or people who are immigrants, right? It can be a geographic community, maybe thinking about things that we see happening within like the Bay Area or California, right? But it could also not just be something that's a location community. It can be a cultural community. So, I mean, a lot of students have written papers about things related to maybe like their interests or some sort of different identities, whether it be religious or ethnic identity or gender identity, right? They're like the possibility is very, very open.
Could you like necessarily write about a community like you're not necessarily a part of, but
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah, I think so, right? Because I mean, it's like you would kind of think about like when you're thinking about why you're researching it is like you could write about a community that like maybe I think about that and as far as like things that are maybe close to me but that I can't fully understand because it's not my experience, right? Like if I were to think about like one of my students in a class, my face-to-face class on campus that I just got out of a little while ago, was wanting to write about like how people in communities, immigrants can feel alienated if they're still like acquiring English as their non-native language, right? And like that's not a community that he belongs to, but he wanted to write about that, and it's similar to me because it relates to his family members. Like my dad is part of that community, like his grandparents are, and that's something that might be important to him. And so like it can also just be something that you're kind of curious about, right? Sometimes there's communities that we know very little about, like that we hear, like for example, I think about in Fairfield, like one of the things I see happening within our community and specifically within the Bay Area is like homelessness is increasing significantly, and the problem just keeps persisting. And it's not a community that I identify as part of, it could still be a community where I could say like within Fairfield I see this and I'm curious about what are some of the ways that are being done to help people who are experiencing homelessness, right? So it doesn't have to be something that you're immediately a member of that community, but it could just be a community that you identify because you're curious about, you care about, or you just want to learn something about.
Yeah, makes sense. So just kind of like just a community you're interested in or like you're kind of
Mhm.
involved with. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I've had like one of the things to do is like because this project is really open, right? Like think about this idea of like you can really go in whatever direction you want, right? Like you might be like, I want to focus on, something that taps into one of my interests. Like I've had a lot of students who are, art majors, want to write about like issues and problems within the art community. I've had students who are really interested in video games. Like one of my favorite papers that I've read that I thought was just like super interesting and just like tapped really well into that student's interest was he's really into video games and like wrote this paper about how video games are people are arguing that the problem is they're being destroyed by like a lot of pay for play content or like loot boxes, and how it's like likened to gambling addiction. And it was just super interesting. And it was like, but he tapped into those, like, I like video games, and here's a problem that I see happening within the video game community, right? And he was able to go in that direction. Sometimes people maybe focus on things in their lives. Like I had a student who wrote another really interesting and strong paper about her experience as being her husband is in the Air Force, and they moved from a different state and moved here to a place where they didn't know anybody when he was stationed on Travis Air Force Base, and wrote this really interesting and strong paper about the problem of military spouses and children on if they're receiving like emotional support when, you know, they could be facing a lot of like difficulty, like kind of uprooting and moving to someplace completely new, right? So I mean, I think that's like, it's super duper wide open, but I think what's most important is you're picking something that is interesting to you, that you would like to spend a while working on this project, right? So
Yeah.
basically like, oh
Like,
yeah, go
all
ahead.
right. Yeah. So like you can like kind of like go into more specifics of like a community, right? And kind of like look at
Mhm.
that. Like I'm thinking I want to do like mental health of like student athletes.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be really, really strong, right? I've had a lot of students focus on like student athletics. Like I had a student who's working on a paper actually this semester is focusing on like, he just started working on the proposal, like, you know, should college athletes be paid? Like kind of focusing on this idea about like their schedules are so demanding and it's hard to work a part-time job. But a lot of, I think, you know, and it came from like watching, I don't know if you've watched that Netflix series, Last Chance U.
Yeah.
Like a lot of those like college athletes, they're like the ones at Laney are like living in their cars and
Mhm.
like very close to homeless or experiencing homelessness. And it was like, but the college is making a good chunk of money off of this program. And that's even more so when you look at like Division I schools, right? So he was kind of looking at that, like, should college athletes be compensated? And it's a, you know, it's a problem, and it's a really interesting topic to go into. So absolutely, you can look at like increased stress, mental health within college athletes. I think that's a great topic.
Okay, cool.
So then what you're going to basically do is like kind of demonstrate that the problem exists, right? Like making sure that you're giving contextual information to show the readers like the scope of this problem. So like who is affected, how are they affected, why are they affected, right? Then and all of your arguments that you're creating throughout this paper are going to come from the articles you're reading. They're not going to come from your opinion or as much your perspective, but from like, here's the different articles that I read, and here is my informed kind of conclusion based off of the things that I'm reading, right? So it's very much so coming from credible sources and things that you found online, like in the online databases. So basically your goal throughout this paper is persuade your reader that the proposed solution that you researched, maybe there's multiple solutions and here's the one, or here's kind of a combination of one that like you think is most feasible and why it's better than alternative solutions or better than what the current like status quo is, right? And so
Yes.
like really that's kind of that big focus is like, here's a problem, you identified the problem, here's how the community is affected. And then throughout the essay is like, here are possible solutions to the problem, here are maybe like critiques of those solutions. And then ultimately in that conclusion, here is the one that I think is most effective. We're going to spend time working through this. I have an outline, I have sample research papers that I'll open up in upcoming weeks. So like today is just kind of thinking about the process of this, but a lot of these things that I'm talking about now I'll make very clear when we get to that point and working on the project.
Okay, cool. Yeah, what I was gonna say is like a lot. So it's like you want to use like outside information to not just like show your solution, but kind of prove that the problem's like existent, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
prove that it's a problem that's worthy of your kind of like that your reader should be concerned by this. And part of that is like, hey, you know, here's what's going on. Here's right. Because like to say it's one thing to be like, you know, that college athletes struggle with mental health. It's another thing to be like, here's some research and here are some articles that I found, and here's kind of that proof, that idea. Now that we've established that this is an issue, here's some possible solutions to that problem.
All right, cool.
And so then basically like, you know, the rest of this down here is kind of like a lot of these ideas of like the stuff that we've talked about, like supported body paragraphs, analysis in your ideas, kind of like this helpful hints. But this thing is really important to think about is like that you want to make sure that you're thinking about, you know, we've talked about this move this semester about like the ideas that you're writing, that you're making sure that you build context for your reader, right? That we're not wanting to assume that our reader automatically knows the things that we're writing about. And a lot of this has kind of been pretending, right? Because like I've read Trevor Noah, or I've familiar with Adichie, and it's like, but in this case, in your research project, I won't be, right? And so it'll be one of those instances where you're going to be writing about something, but like your reader might be like, in this case, I won't have the context either for the topic you're researching or for the articles that you've read. So you want to make sure that like you're building effective context for the reader, right? And then kind of thinking about like how tying back into that so what, that kind of frame quotation idea of like, here's the research you found, here's the quote you found, or the paraphrase you found, and here's kind of that idea like quotes don't speak for themselves. Like here's what you want your reader to take away from that quoted passage. And again, we'll talk about all this when we get there to that point. But to kind of think about for today, basically like your research paper, this is kind of the big thing, is that you're going to have at least 4 sources for the paper. So 3 of those sources are going to come from library databases, right? Like, so the same moves you did with LR10, cruising through the databases, finding different articles, right? Like that's where 3 of the sources you're going to be getting is going to be coming from. The 4th source is pretty open. So for example, you might want to watch a documentary or listen to a podcast or a TED Talk, or maybe a video of an interview of an athlete, for example, or a college athlete, right? Like something like that could work really, really well, because I think it can add a lot of like emotion to your paper and kind of like a layer of credibility or a layer of complexity that just like reading about it maybe can't. But the other thing, you can also go in maybe a different direction where like you might want to actually interview somebody and ask them some of those questions, right? So like if you're doing like, for example, researching maybe like stressors in college athletes' lives that can contribute to mental health issues, then maybe one of the things you want to do is like, if you know somebody or want to talk to somebody, interview them, it's like, what are some of the current stressors that college athletes face? Or maybe, it's very easy for me to put you in contact with people on campus for regardless of like what you're researching, right? Like it'd be like, hey, I have a question about this. Like we have counselors who work with our athletes at Solano College, and you might want to interview one of them, right? But it's like something like that as your 4th source can really add like a interesting layer to your paper. You're welcome to have the 4th source be from the library databases. But like, for example, the student who's writing the paper in my previous class about language acquisition and how, acquiring English and still being in the stages of developing English for somebody who's newly immigrated to this country can feel alienating. They're interviewing their grandparents, right? Like, and I think that that's a really credible source to use because that person has experienced it.
Yeah, makes sense. So like kind of just find people like directly affected by like what you're wanting to do, and like
if you wanted to do an interview, it doesn't have to be an interview. It could easily be like a documentary or something like that. That could also work really well.
Okay.
But I just wanted to give all of you like freedom with that 4th source, because I think that there's like a lot of valuable ways of going through research that is true to the way that we learn things and that we develop our perspective on things other than just reading articles, right? So I think that's why it's nice to have that open source. So this paper should be in the neighborhood of about 5 pages. Again, it's not going to be due until the end of the semester, but what is going to be due is I've like chunked this up a little bit, right? So like kind of thinking about this idea of like, as we work towards like writing this paper, is like the research project is kind of like a marathon, right? Like, and along the way, I'll give you little places of like, here's what you're going to be working on first, here's what's going to be working second, and there's going to be plenty of instruction that'll come in between these steps. So source reports we'll talk about next week. I'll have another mini lesson where I kind of talk through them and I'll share examples of those. We'll have an outline for the research paper. And again, when that time comes in the upcoming weeks, I'll share examples of outlines, talk through the outline and give you some pointers to kind of help work through that. And then finally, the final draft of the research paper won't be due until the end of the semester, right? But for this week, we're working on just the research proposal, which is exactly that, right? It's just kind of like a way for you to start thinking about what you might want to write about. And then kind of like, here's the plan on what I'm going to be writing about, right? So that's posted just as an assignment here in Canvas. And it's a chance for me to kind of read through this and then give you my feedback of like, hey, I think this topic's going to work really well. You're on the right track. Or, maybe you might want to, sometimes it's like, we think about topics that are too big, right? Like, so if you were to say like, for example, like, if you were to say like, how are athletes, does it contribute to mental health issues, the stress or whatever? It's like, if it's just all athlete, that's a really big topic. But if you move into like narrowing down to college athletes, that might be a better focus, right? Because sometimes like picking something that's too big can be really overwhelming. There can be a ton to have to focus on. And then sometimes picking something that's too small, there might not be enough there. So it's kind of like finding that like just right zone, right? And so I think like your topic works really well, but like as you're working on your proposals, I can just give a quick little bit of feedback of like, this topic looks good, you're ready to start researching, or, you know, you might want to focus a little bit and, you know, think about this direction. And as you're working on the proposals, if any of you have questions on, you know, wanting to run through some ideas with me, like, or meet with Chris, like we're available and we can meet with you and talk through your ideas. But basically for the research proposal, it's super informal. You can just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you want to answer these questions, right? So basically you're describing the community to someone who's unfamiliar with the community. What is it like to be a member of the community, or how is this community viewed by the larger society? If you're in fact a member, if you're not, then maybe like what details can you give about the community? What is the problem related to the community that you're going to analyze? You'll write a little bit about that. And how does it impact the community? What are some of the other communities or people or groups or kind of forces that have an impact on this problem? Sometimes like other things are contributing to this problem. Sometimes other people are affected by this problem, right? Like I feel like with college athletes, like on one hand, yes, it's the stress of maybe the demands of being in school and playing a sport, but also I think a lot of times like colleges contribute to that, right? They increase that stress. They put a lot of expectations on students that are it's very difficult to be a successful college student, period, let alone try to juggle a full school load and, you know, playing at a very high level of competition, right? Like, so I think that that's one of those things that can be difficult. So maybe like there's multiple things contributing to this problem. So basically, like, what do you believe is kind of the underlying or some of the underlying causes of this problem? Next, like a little about like, where is your curiosity? So like, what do you want to research? What things do you want to learn about? These could be things that maybe you don't know about that you'd like to learn more about. And then usually we go into these topics with understanding something about them, right? So what do you already know about this topic? Maybe this is an identity that's one of yours, and you could say, here's things that I know, or maybe you know people who are college athletes who are like, here's the things that I see, and here's kind of what I already know. You can answer all of these without doing any research at all. This is just to kind of help you flesh out and share a little about what you're thinking of writing about.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Any questions at all on the prompt or on the overview for the research proposal?
No, I'm definitely understanding it like almost fully now. But the one
Okay.
question I would have would be regarding the research. So should we really just be using like the school library and the different systems we've learned about in there to
Yes,
do our research?
exactly. All those databases. So next week, I'm going to introduce the second part of the assignment, which is like the source reports, right? And when I do, I'll kind of give some different overview on like places to look and how to go about starting that research. But for this week, it's just kind of like, as you're working on SA3, just kind of start thinking through like, I might write about this, I might write about that. And then maybe within the next couple of days, put your research proposal together. And it's just, you know, a page of writing. It's not a ton of writing, half a page to a page of writing of just like, here's a little bit of what I'm thinking of writing about.
Okay, cool. When's the SA3 going to be due?
SA3 is not going to be due until, let me just check my module really quick. So we're now week 13, so week 15. So
Okay,
not next
cool.
week, it'll be due the following week.
Just
and then
on
we'll
Sunday?
finish. What's that?
Just on that Sunday?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so I just, you know, this way I'm giving, I know it seems like a lot kind of getting the two prompts at the same time, but the reason that I give the research project so early is just so you have time to kind of start thinking about it and being like, you know, it's kind of one of those marathon projects, right? In that first week, it's just like, oh, I might write about this or I might write about that. I just like to have it to kind of let those, for me, it's helpful to get those things early, kind of start thinking about them early and then be like, okay, now here's where I'm going to go, you know, and then after the SA3, then we're like full board with the research project at the end of the semester.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
Cool. But like I said, if you have any questions at all when you're working, or, you know, kind of fine tuning your prompt for anybody, just like let us know. We're happy to be able to meet and, you know, chat through some of these ideas with each other.
For SA3, how many quotes do we need necessarily, like from the book or the articles?
I think like about 4 would be pretty effective, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Okay, cool.
right?
Thank
Like, and you kind of think about with the book that you're using, like the span of the book. So like showing the reader multiple places throughout the book, because sometimes if we think about like how, it's like say for has like, if example, how he's affected by his environment, that changes significantly as Noah ages throughout the book, right? Like, so like kind of what was viewed as a limitation later on, or like looking at like maybe kind of like his mixed ethnicity like early on, and there's a lot of complexity with that, but then there's a lot of places too where he uses that to like his advantage. And so I think like kind of the mix is being able to find multiple examples throughout the book to be able to support those claims you're making.
Okay, sounds good.